of the cases lost at least $1 million. The smallest organizations suffer disproportionately large losses due to the occupational fraud. And so again, I think it's very imperative for smaller organizations to ensure that they have some sort of anti-fraud programming going on within their organization. And as we talk through some of the processes to do this later on, it doesn't really matter that you don't have a compliance officer or an internal audit officer within your small organization, but what does matter is that you do the very basics to ensure that you protect yourself from these types of extraordinary losses. Over 30% of the cases involve more than one category of occupational fraud. So I always think this is a really interesting statistic, because if you're experiencing a check tampering fraudulent activity that you discover, you really need to address within your investigation what other the types of related incidents could be going on, because over a third of all fraud within your organization, there could be another related fraudulent issue. And here's some other interesting statistics that, asset misappropriation was the most common occurrence. Corruption schemes, less common, although a fairly significant loss. And then 9% of the cases involve financial statement fraud, which is, had impacts of over $1 million. So again, some numbers that can be devastating to your ongoing operations. So the types of typical occupational frauds that occur: embezzlement, procurement fraud. I can speak to procurement fraud with a couple of our clients that, especially if you have overseas operations, or they don't even have to be overseas, it could be across the country. And if you don't have the proper protocols in place, procurement fraud is a fairly easy one for off-site employees to create. And we certainly had, I've had more than one client who's had issues with contracts going out to family members and not being properly vetted in the market. So it's an important to get those protocols in place to ensure you're protected. Financial statement fraud, again, that's the one that can cause you really significant harm. Expenses, of the common one for small and large businesses. Asset misappropriation, bribery. Again, the bribery element, if you are doing business overseas, this can be extremely devastating to an organization because of all the legislation that's in place both in the United States and Canada and now the UK. Corruption, again, under the Bribery Act and the Foreign Corruption Act, something that you need to be aware of if you're doing business overseas. Misappropriation of cash, the very basics, especially for small business, skimming and check tampering. So these are the types of frauds that you need to look out for, and we'll talk about some of the basic internal controls that you can put into place.
This isn't working.
This isn't working?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Hey, can everyone see my screen? If anyone can't see the screen, please let me know. You can put it up in the question box as well. So right now we're going to go through the basic fraud triangle, and this is a classic. Everyone's probably seen this before. It's a classic metaphor for how someone gets into a situation where they decide to commit fraud against their employer. And the first one is part of the fraud triangle is the pressure. So perhaps they've got some financial stresses in their life, perhaps they've got a gambling problem, perhaps they're going through a divorce. There's some sort of extraordinary pressure on an individual that causes them to go through the process of justifying stealing from their employer. The second is the opportunity, and this is really what we're going to address today in the seminar, is how you can detour any type of opportunity for someone to abuse their position of trust to steal from you. And it's also, it's critical, as I say, that the perpetrator be able to solve his problem in secret. So very often the embezzler or what have you will be operating in isolation, and so we're going to discuss in a minute some of the red flags that you can start to look for to detect this at an earlier stage. The third part of the triangle is rationalization, and if you go onto the ACFC site, they have an excellent series of videos where they've actually interviewed people who've been caught embezzling or stealing from their organizations, and it's amazing to watch the rationalization of these individuals. They don't actually take any kind of responsibility for their guilt. They actually put their reasoning or the rationalization against the company. The company didn't have internal controls. They made it that easy for me to steal. It's almost like they wanted me to steal. They're making so much money. I felt that and I haven't had a raise in 2 years, I felt that I was owed this money. So it's very interesting when you watch the psyche of an embezzler or a fraudulent person and how they can rationalize and justify their decision-making process. So I was going to put up a second polling question right now, and that question is, according to research, most embezzlers decide to commit their crimes because they're essentially dishonest, they're living beyond their means, they have drug problems, or all of the above. And if everybody wants to vote on that right now and to say, why do you think that they decide they're going to commit their crimes? We'll leave it open for a couple seconds. Okay, so we can close the polling now. 40% of the people on the call said they believe they're living beyond their means, and 60% said all of the above. And actually, according to the ACFC, it's they're living beyond their means. The pressure of living beyond their means is kind of the lead reason that people decide that they need to steal from their organization. So some of the common red flags of a perpetrator: living beyond their means, and that is the #1 red flag for you as either an internal auditor or as a fellow employee to look for. If someone's showing up and they're suddenly driving a Bentley and they're in the accounts receivable department, pretty good sign that something's going on. Financial difficulties. So if someone's going through a divorce, if they've had their house foreclosed on, something like that. If they exhibit control issues within the organization, if they're very, they won't share their duties, they are very protective of whatever financial statements they're controlling, that's usually a red flag. If they have unusually close relationships with vendors or customers, and if they control those relationships and don't share them within the office, that's another opportunity to identify a red flag. Irritability, suspiciousness, defensiveness. Oftentimes when someone's been doing this for quite a long time, they can become somewhat paranoid, and that's another characteristic to pick up on. Addiction problems, whether it be gambling or substance abuse, those are things to be aware of in the organization. Anytime there's a refusal to take vacations, and we have so many clients, especially smaller clients, where you have a trusted bookkeeper who is your girl Friday and they don't take vacations and they're in there on a Saturday. That's a typical red flag, and I cannot tell you how many people that we've worked with who've had long-term trusted employees who have blatantly stolen from them. And whether that's by using a corporate credit card, whether it's a check writing campaign, whether it's a cash skimming, it is often a key employee. And if they're a wheeler dealer kind of an attitude, and it's another red flag for you to look at. Some other red flags, and these are more basics as opposed to characteristics, but borrowing money from coworkers. If you have creditors or collectors appearing at work, that's a pretty good sign. Again, gambling and substance abuse. Easily annoyed at reasonable questioning. So if you're questioning some transaction that you see on a bank statement and they're getting annoyed with you, you might want to explore it a bit further. Refusing vacations or promotions. Again, a promotion that may change their job description or may take them to another office. That's always a red flag to kind of explore a little bit more. Bragging about significant purchases, again, if they've got a new car, carrying unusually large sums of money, and rewriting records in the guise of neatness. So again, that's probably not as legitimate now in the age of computer and technology for all of our banking, but surely even if running is the petty cash, if they're redoing the petty cash statements by hand, you might want to take a look at that. So the common white-collar criminal characteristics, and these stats I found fascinating. They're most likely to be married. They're most likely to be a member of a church. They usually have postgraduate education. The age range is quite substantive, but it's usually in the older age group. 77% work in accounting, operations, sales, executive, customer service, purchasing, and finance, which makes sense because these are the areas of the operations that are most easily violated. They're usually socially conforming. The employment tenure is anywhere between 1 and 20 years, but again, it skews on the longer-term employees who run these massive fraudulent campaigns within your organization. They act alone 70% of the time. I do have a number of clients who've had, again, off-site operations where the collusion does take place, and they have the general manager of the off-site actually running a separate group of books and a separate group of business on the same paper. So you have to be aware of that type of collusionary kind of transactions, but for the most part, it is a single perpetrator who conducts the fraud. Males tend to steal more amounts than females, and they usually have no arrest record. We'll talk a little bit later about pre-screening the employees. And we all do reference checks when we hire employees, but I think that it's worth the while sometimes to spend the extra money and actually do a proper pre-screening check on them. So some of the factors contributing to fraud: ineffective management, and this is going to come up over and over again in our webinar, where we talk about the lack of internal controls and the lack of management's awareness on what's going on in the operations can really allow things to slip through the cracks. No management or control overrides. Again, if there's transactions that need to be addressed and substantiated by management, those policies need to be in place. Collusion among employees with little or no supervision. And again, I'm thinking of a client of ours who had an off-site office with, again, long-term employees who colluded to steal from the organization. There wasn't enough management input from the head office, and these people started running amok, and it caused massive losses for the organization. Lacks internal controls, and again, we'll talk to you about some of the more basic internal controls that you can put into place, and they're basic. They're so incredibly basic that one would kind of question why you didn't have them in place, but I think as we all run our businesses, sometimes the more strategic policies and procedures that should be in place are foregone in order to get our day-to-day tasks done. Lack of account reconciliation. So this is a key thing, and we always talk with our small business owners that they should do simple things, even get the bank statements sent to their home so that they can actually do an off-site reconciliation themselves. And do spot audits and make sure that the credit cards are reconciled exactly every month. Lack of a code of conduct or ethics is a key issue. That is the most basic code and policy you can have in place. And while you can write the code and have it in the employee handbook, if you don't train on it, if you don't have your employees sign off that they're aware that the code exists and that they'll comply with the mandate of the code, then there's no point in having the code. And lack of a hotline. And while I'm not pitching our services today, a hotline is the #1 way to discover tips in an organization, and every organization, regardless of size, should have a hotline for their employees to come forward. It's that last safety net that you can offer your employees if they know something and they are uncomfortable about coming forward to the direct supervisors. So fraud prevention. One of the first things that you have to do is create that structure that discourages and eliminates fraud. So that starts with drafting the code of conduct, the code of ethic, a whistleblower procedure that prevents fraud. And one of the most important things to consider when you're drafting your policies and procedures is to ensure that ramifications and reverberations that will happen if the code is violated. So if you have a level of expectation on ethics and honesty and behavior within the organization, you also need to specifically address what will happen if that code is violated. The other important thing that we believe is that when you're drafting the policy, you ensure that every employee knows that the level of expectation from the company is that if they see something that's amiss, if they feel something's amiss, they report it. So if there's a red flag that comes up to one employee, maybe they feel that they don't want to report it because they don't know for sure if something's going on, the mandate within the policy is if you feel there's something, you need to report it. So, and there is a variation. So nefarious or malicious allegations in their intent won't be tolerated. But if there's a red flag and someone sees it, the organization expects that person to come forward, and that's part of their mandate as an employee. And that can be reiterated and communicated by management, and that's where tone at the top becomes very important. And I know it's a very overused statement in this realm of compliance, but if the management's not leading by example, you're not going to get that feedback from the employees, and you might not even get the buy-in where they feel that they need to be loyal and honest within the organization. So one of the key things is educating the employees about fraud. So that's, first of all, the introduction of the code, the mandate of the code, the expectations of the code, how to detect fraud. So again, training your employees on what red flags to look for, ensuring that they're reconciling the bank accounts every month and that they're reconciling the expense reports, and perhaps even doing spot audits on those expense reports. And if they do see something, how to report it. So it's one thing to say we have a code of ethics. It's another thing on how do you execute on that code of ethics. So again, either having proper reporting channels, and again, having confidential and anonymous reporting channels is key, because especially depending on the size of your organization, if you're a smaller company, people are going to be much more intimidated about coming forward. And you need to be able to reassure them that you've got the processes in place to protect their anonymity and their confidentiality when they're going to come forward and report. Committing the resources. So I think I spoke a little bit earlier to this, or when you're a small business, you're really focused on getting the day-to-day tasks done, getting the sales out the door. This is why small businesses are more susceptible, because they don't have the resources for internal controls or audits. You probably don't have an internal auditor. You probably don't even have an internal general counsel. But that's why it's even more important that you ensure that you've got some processes in place, starting with that code, going down through the ranks of ensuring that you do spot audits, because those aren't hard to do, that you ensure that reconciliations are done, that you ensure that duties are segregated so you don't have one individual who's in charge of AR and AP. You need to make sure that you start separating out all those duties and even rotating them if it's possible within the organization. Often there's a misplaced sense of trust in small organizations, and this is where we see the chronic issues with long-term organizations who've had the same internal accountant for years, and or internal sales manager, and that misplaced sense of trust. Even though you work with a team, you want to trust your team, you still need to look for the red flags, and you still need to ensure that you've got those controls in place. So if they are having an issue and they can rationalize stealing from the organization, that level of detection and that level of deterrence is there. So again, ensuring the tools are put into place so that any perceived discovery of fraud will be dealt with swiftly and severely. That is a huge deterrent, and that can be, again, reiterated through your code and through management's behavior and tone, and setting that stage for the level of expectation of behavior that you expect of your employees. Investing in IT security is becoming more and more imperative for organizations regardless of size, with the hacking that's been going on, and with the urgency and the necessity for companies to protect their customer data. You need to start ensuring that you've got whatever security protocols in place to protect the customer data. You can be liable far beyond just the legacy of your business, but you can be liable on so many different levels now if your customer data is compromised. And conducting surprise audits and inventory counts, again, it seems so elementary, but small organizations and large do not do it, and it needs to be something that you as a manager, as an owner, schedule and ensure that you do on a regular basis. So we're going through simple 10 ways to improve fraud detection. So we use a hotline, and again, this comes down from the ACFC. It comes from any literature that, if you're reading about good governance and compliance, is using a hotline is the most common fraud detection technique. It'll help you uncover fraud up to 18 months earlier. That's sort of a standard stat. If you don't have a hotline, it's going to take you that much longer to discover it. If you do have a hotline, it gives your employees one, the confidence to know that the company really cares about what's going on. I can give you an example of a client that we signed in the last 12 months, and they had an ongoing kind of toxic issue. And we came in and put the hotline in place, and immediately the perpetrators who were creating a lot of issues were immediately identified. And the employees who used the hotline actually thanked management for putting it into place, because they said it finally showed that they cared about what was going on the front lines. And it was a really great acknowledgement of the fact that the employees wanted to be heard. They felt they didn't have an opportunity or a channel to be heard. When you do introduce a hotline or any kind of other whistleblower procedure, you want to make sure that all of the stakeholders have multiple ways to reach you. So it's not just a hotline. You want to be able to do a custom email, and so you could say, tips@companyabc.com, and that goes to your director of HR, it goes to your CFO or your general counsel. A web portal, again, it's an excellent tool. You're not going to probably build one of those on your own, but if you're with a third party, then you'd use a web portal. And mail and fax. Mail and fax are still options, and if people feel that they don't want to talk to someone on the phone, they're, we service companies all over the world, and we still get mail and fax reports. So it's just offering any opportunity for an employee to reach out to you to let you know that something's going on is important. Using a third-party anonymous hotline ensures that your employees feel safe and secure. So it gives them, again, that sort of arm's length. They know that they're not calling directly to the HR person who might recognize their voice. And again, with third-party providers like ourselves, the agents who are taking the calls are trained in empathetic and investigative techniques. So they're going to provide a safe and comfortable environment for that employee who is often very nervous when they're coming forward. And they'll also be trained on how to get as much information as possible to help you in any kind of an investigation. And training employees. So again, back to points I made earlier, you need to train your employees on what fraud looks like, all the different types of occupational fraud that can be run through your business, and look for those red flags and how to detect them. So there's training that needs to take place on so many levels. It's just on the basic expectations under your code of conduct or ethics. And then the training on really what types of fraud are there, because there's so many different types, and you also have to take into consideration your own business. Are you a manufacturer? Are you an extraction company? Are you a retailer? And take into consideration the most common types of fraud that can occur within your own business operations. And then train again. And we talk about training again all the time, because you need to be constantly reminded of where the opportunities are for fraud, where the opportunities are to report, where the opportunities are to engage with management, and again, on what the level of expectation is on part of the employees. So again, the fraud triangle, you want to be able to look at the behavioral traits, the red flags, if someone's becoming especially defensive or suspicious in nature, and you want to act on those, because the longer that you leave it, the more massive the fraud can become. Reducing the opportunity. So again, as I said, when they were introducing or interviewing the various whistleblowers on the ACFC site, it was amazing that they felt they had the right to do this because the company hadn't closed the opportunity for them. The company let those doors open, and so they felt they were justified in taking the money because they just, they didn't put the internal controls in place. But certainly segregating sensitive duties amongst more than one employee is key. If you've got one person holding on to all of the bank statements and approving the expenses and doing AR and AP, you're going to run into trouble. Protecting your assets. So again, it goes back to reconciliation from the petty cash, especially for smaller organizations, to company-issued credit cards. And we've certainly seen the frauds where there's a credit card, and then the accounting person who's involved in the fraud gets sub-credit cards on the main credit card, and those are hidden from the people that are actually approving the expenses. There's so many opportunities for fraud with the credit cards and with expense reports. And you can actually take seminars through the ACFE just on expense report fraud. So very, very important to reconcile, and again, to spot audit the expenses. and conducting random audits. That's it. You know, it's something that most small companies don't do, but I think it's a really integral part of protecting your organization and letting everybody know that, you know what, the opportunities are not far and wide because you are going to be doing these spot audits. And the policies, get your policies in place. There's so many different areas where you can just get a policy template and then edit it to your own needs. So you want to make sure that when you do get the policy, 1, again, you train on it. 2, it's in the employee handbook. 3, it's on your internal website. 4, take advantage of lunch and learns. Take advantage of any kind of corporate intranet, corporate newsletters that you have to share the code. And if you have the opportunity to share sanitized cases of fraud that the company has experienced in the past, those are excellent opportunities to train your employees on what to look for. And also, you know, if you can, and again, sometimes you can't because of the privacy of past employees or current employees, but train on the outcomes of what happened with any kind of fraud that you've experienced. So internal controls, I've put internal controls equals fraud prevention. If you don't have internal controls, the likelihood of you experiencing some format of fraud are huge, and they're exponential. So every piece of internal control behavior you can put into place will protect you to a greater extent. And one of the important considerations is the company's attitude towards fraud, and that can be reiterated and communicated again through your code and through management. But I think that there has to be a very strong message sent to your employees that the company is intolerant of any sort of fraud. And when you communicate that level of intolerance, it also helps to deter the opportunity for someone to think they can get away with the fraud. And with the internal controls, that is, again, is getting the segregation of duties, it's getting the various management balances and checks put into place so that there are multiple people approving invoices and actually going back and mandating or checking that the work was done or the inventory was delivered and the appropriate amount of inventory was delivered. And then, again, creating an ethical organizational culture. So part of introducing the code and part of introducing a hotline and part of introducing this training all reinforces a company's commitment to an ethical organizational culture. And all of those things can help you in deterring fraud, because again, the fraudulent people, when they've done all these studies and you read the literature, if they feel that it's a slippery environment and there's not enough oversight on behalf of management, this is where you can get taken advantage of. Providing a self-assessment checklist to the various departments and having them go through the process and then reconciling it is an excellent tool. So, you know, oftentimes what happens as organizations grow, they operate in silos. And so the checklist that perhaps you have in the accounting department is far different from what you might have in the production department. And in order to really create this comprehensive and cohesive system, you want to have all your managers in the various silos do a self-assessment and then bring that team in and collaborate so that you have a consistent set of controls across the organization. You know, and one of the things that again, it's talked about a fair bit is that there's a fluid set of tools involving business, technology, the environment that you're in, your past experiences with fraud. All of those need to be taken into consideration as you're drafting out your plan. And you need to take into consideration, again, the opportunities in your specific business where you think you can be breached. So assessing and reviewing current policies and protocols, that needs to be done on an annual basis because the environment changes. So maybe what your current policy was 3 years ago isn't really applicable to what you're doing right now. And again, that could be because of, you know, changes in your distribution, changes in your production facility, or changes in the nature of your business, and actually changes in your management team. So it's always good to try and just have a calendar schedule to say, do I have all my policies up to date? Have I tested my whistleblower hotline? Have I, what breaches have occurred? What can I share throughout the organization for various breaches? If it happened in the accounting department, can I share it with my production team to let them know that this has happened? And again, the more communication that you have, and I think I talk about this in a little bit in the presentation, is key to really reiterating, again, your commitment to an ethical organization. And that speaks to this last bullet, with ensuring ownership of controls is shared throughout the organization. So when we talk about that, it's in making sure that your HR team, your compliance team, if you have one, your investigations team, your audit, your general counsel, and again, a lot of companies won't have all of these silos just based on the nature of their size, but surely if you have an HR manager and you've got senior management, and you will have IT, you need to ensure that everyone knows what internal controls are put into place, and ensure that they share any type of protocols they have in their own silos so that it can be cross-referenced across the organization. And again, key to review, evaluate, test, reintroduce on a regular basis. And I think testing is a really good thing to take note of, because again, it's about the spot audit. It's about testing those internal controls and ensuring. It's about even putting a fake invoice through and seeing if it gets tagged. These are tests that you can put through your own system. And ensuring the interdisciplinary team is in place. And again, a lot of our clients, they have their interdisciplinary team meet biannually to discuss all of the facets of the operation, to ensure that the testing is done, and to actually talk about the test results and see where they can improve on their policies or their procedures. And again, ensuring an open door policy and a speak up culture is in place. That's a key one, and that speaks more to an ethical culture as opposed to an internal control. But I always like to think that having that open door policy is part of your internal controls, because if people feel that they have an open and an open environment, then they will be more likely to come forward. So some of the communication protocols, once you've gone through your code development, you've gone through training, you've gone through ensuring that you've got your segregation of duties and the balances and checks all there, you want to ensure that it's all communicated throughout the organization. So the timely notification and sharing of events is key, and that is where you do suffer a breach. You want to ensure that the appropriate people are notified, that action is being taken, that action is being communicated throughout the organization, and you share those events. Organizations can learn and respond specifically by the breaches that they've experienced. And again, amongst the various silos, it's kind of key. And anytime you can share, again, the sanitized event to your overall employee staff, that's excellent, because it helps everybody understand what can happen in the organization. Regular interaction and communications between departments is paramount. And again, so many companies don't do this, but it is a best practice to ensure that you've got the interdisciplinary team all working together on your internal controls. You need to ensure the employees know of the hotline or complaint procedures and how to file a report, because if you have a hotline and you're not promoting it, you're not going to get any information. You need to have posters up in the staff rooms. You need to give them wallet cards. You need to ensure that they know that there's their anonymity and their confidentiality will be protected. You also need, if you do have international offices, you need to ensure that that information is shared with them in their local language, and that the essence of the message is received. Oftentimes we found with clients that we've onboarded, they can have it at head office. The message is not received in the overseas office, and management in the general managers overseas are not carrying the same message as the head office. So it's really key, again, and this is where I think the interdisciplinary team helps. If you've got your communication specialist, if you've got your HR, if you've got any risk and general counsel, they all come together to ensure that it filters down throughout the organization, so it goes deep and wide. You have to include mandatory reporting of fraud concerns in all related policies. So it doesn't have to just be in the code of conduct or the code of ethics, but any kind of procedural policy, whether it be in accounting again or production, fraud should always be mentioned somewhere within that policy. And again, the mandatory reporting and then the how to report. It's very important to include. The other thing that I don't actually mention in this presentation, but I think is worth noting, is that anti-retaliation verbiage in any of these kind of policies, more specifically in the whistleblower and the code of ethics, is key. So if you're going to introduce these types of policies, you need to ensure that the employees know that there won't be any retaliation based on their reporting. So some opportunities to promote the hotline and the code come through, again, the employee handbook, the newsletter, lunch and learns, the company website, sanitized cases, actual training, just basically on the code of ethics, and the fraud awareness training that you can provide to all staff to help them provide red flags. If you don't give your employees those tools on how to identify fraud, they may be working right alongside someone who is completely breaching the organization and not realizing what's going on. So, a post-mortem event analysis. Now, this is something that is, again, key to any kind of fraud prevention program. I think it's key to any kind of business. You know, you go through, if you lose a business deal, you go through a post-mortem and try and figure out where the deficits were. When you go through a fraudulent event, it's really important to come back with your team after the fact and address what happened, how it happened, and asking those tough questions. And again, you're not pointing fingers, but you want to say, what were we missing? What policy, what procedure, what guideline, what tasks, you know, what protective measures did you miss? And if so, if there was a policy missing, or if the guideline was in place, how come the employee didn't know about it? And those are, I mean, they're elementary questions, but they're key questions. And again, to have a business case after the fact of a fraudulent breach is an excellent tool to share with your management team and with your various senior level executives. Corrective action education needs to be taken to circumvent the same situation in the future. So if you suffer a breach and you don't go through that postmortem, it really just sets you up to suffer the breach again. You need to take definitive action after you've experienced a breach. And then this is a chart. It's a good chart. So you can walk through kind of the basics of putting in an anti-fraud program. And depending on the size of your organization, you can do the center column and just ensure that you're doing the very, very basics to educate your employees, to put the policies in place, and get that sort of very basic coverage down. If you're a larger organization, you can look at the third column where you can go into much more complicated, comprehensive, international considerations. So, you know, the very basics. Do you have an anti-fraud plan? Do you have a code of conduct? Very, very basics. And really a good test on these first ones, depending on the size of your organization, is to really go through a risk assessment. Where are my weaknesses? Where are the opportunities for things to go awry? And then start to address that. If you're a larger organization, then you start to ask the bigger questions. You know, within your contracts, do you have the right to audit clauses? Do you require certificates of anti-corruption? Do you require your vendors to have a whistleblower hotline in place? These are the types of things that you want to take into consideration, especially if you're multinational. You want to ensure that if something does go wrong in China, you're not going to be liable with the DOJ or the SEC because you haven't put any of these things into place. And oftentimes, if you do run into issues with the DOJ or the SEC, they are going to take into consideration what types of anti-fraud and corruption programming you have in place, what kind of training that you've done, what kind of materials have you shared with your employees, and that can all be fairly, depending on the level of prosecution or the level of fines that they're going to submit your organization to, they'll take into consideration what kind of compliance. It's all fine and dandy if you have a code of conduct. If no one's been trained on it, they'll take a look at that. So it's just an important consideration. So this is a great chart to take a look at as you start to develop an anti-fraud program. And finally, the consequences of a lack of diligence. And truly, it's just lack of diligence because it's fairly simple to put an anti-fraud program into place. It takes some work, but it's not completely overall consuming, and it's something that you can do over time and roll it out over the course of 6 or 12 months. But again, if you don't do this, the things that can happen to your organization is the loss of your reputation, fraud losses, financial instability. If you're a smaller organization and someone takes out $500,000, you know, some of the long-term thefts that we've seen with some clients have been really catastrophic, and they've been slow and steady, but you know, kept some of our clients on the edge for a long time. Plummeting employee morale. You know, if people know that something's going on, they don't have access to report it. It can be really devastating to the team. It can create this toxic environment, and it's a simple thing to alleviate. And finally, regulatory fines. That's a large issue if you're a public company. So the 4 simple steps is creating the code of conduct. It's the first thing you need to do. You need to train your employees on red flags, on the code, on the repercussions, and what the level of expectation is. And then implementing the ethics hotline is another key. And again, it doesn't have to be through third party. You can have your own ethics hotline. Ideally, it's with a third party, but you can, as long as you have that method that provides an anonymous and confidential channel for your employees, you'll be more likely to detect fraud. And it also, again, it sends a statement that you are open to receive these types of reports. And the most important thing is management, endorsement, and communications. And we always, when we're rolling out a client on an ethics reporting system, is ask that their CEO deliver a letter that speaks to the commitment of management to the organization. And it's a commitment to the organization, but it's also a commitment to the employees, because you're trying to set up an ethical organization that expects ethical behavior of your employees and expects everyone to protect the organization and your fellow employees. So it's a bit of a mother-all kind of a statement, but it's a statement that resonates, and it really sets the tone for the rest of the organization. And then finally, if anyone has any questions, we can address them now. We can also ask our third polling question, which is basically, given all the fraud prevention methods within organizations, which one is probably the most effective? And it's reducing rationalization, having an open door policy, increasing the perception of detection, or pre-screening employees. So we'll let everybody vote for a few seconds here and then get the answer. And I also want to let you know that if you have any questions after the seminar, feel free to email me directly or call, and we can certainly address any of your questions. And if you're looking for any assistance on setting up an anti-fraud program, or want to talk about an ethics hotline, we'd love to talk to you about that as well. So we want to close the poll. We've got 50% of people said increasing the perception of detection, 33% of having an open door policy, and 17% of pre-screening employees. And ultimately, all of them are important to reduce fraud, but given the studies from the ACFE, they say that increasing the perception of detection might well be the most effective fraud prevention method. Controls, for example, do little good in forestalling internal theft if their presence isn't known to those at risk. But letting employees, managers, and executives know that people are actively seeking out information and are watching is one of the most important keys to detecting and deterring fraud in an organization. So I thank everybody for attending today. The video will be available on our website at a later date, so if you wanted to log back in to revisit anything that we talked about today, you're welcome to do so. And finally, if anybody wants to download the 7 steps to introducing a whistleblower hotline, an email will be sent out and you'll be able to, or actually we're doing a poll. You can, if you're interested in receiving an ebook, you can click on the yes button and we'll send you an ebook on setting up a whistleblower hotline. So thank you very much, and have a lovely Thursday.